My stepdaughter called me 11 days after my husband's funeral to tell me I had 30 days to vacate his house. I had been married to Walter Sinclair for 22 years. I had nursed him through 2 heart surgeries, a stroke that took 8 months of his speech and mobility to partially recover, and the slow decline of his final year, when I fed him by hand and changed his clothes and learned to administer injections because the home health aide could not come every day and someone had to do it. I had done all of that as his wife, not his nurse, not his caretaker for hire, his wife, in the house we had shared for 2 decades on Sedgefield Road in Charlotte, North Carolina. I want you to sit with that timeline for a moment because I think the specific number matters more than people realize until it happens to them. 11 days. I had not yet finished writing thank you notes for the flowers. I had not yet gone through Walter's closet. I had not yet slept a full night without waking at 3 in the morning out of decades of habit, reaching across the bed before remembering. 11 days is not enough time to begin grieving in any organized way. It is barely enough time to remember to eat regularly. And it was, apparently, exactly enough time for Patrice to decide that the period of courtesy owed to a widow had expired. 11 days after I buried him, his daughter from his first marriage called me and told me, in a voice that had clearly rehearsed every word, that the house belonged to her and her brother now, that I had no legal claim to it, and that she would prefer I be out within 30 days so they could begin preparing it for sale. I said, Patrice, I don't understand. Walter and I own this house together. She said, not according to the will, Marguerite. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said that, in the kitchen, by the window that looked out over the garden Walter and I had planted together our 2nd year of marriage. A garden that had outlived his ability to tend it and that I had kept up alone through his decline because some part of me believed that as long as the garden was alive, something of the life we had built together was still intact. I stood at that window holding the phone and feeling the particular vertigo of being told, with total confidence, that something I believed to be solid ground was not ground at all. My name is Marguerite Sinclair. I am 66 years old, and what I am about to tell you is the story of what I found when I finally read, in full, the will that Walter's children had been quoting to me in fragments, and what it took to prove that the fragments they had chosen were not the whole document. I met Walter in 2002. I was 42 years old, divorced 11 years, working as a dental hygienist, with no particular expectation that my life had room left in it for a second marriage. Walter was 51, a widower for 3 years with 2 adult children, Patrice, then 26, and her brother Marcus, 23, both of whom had loved their mother fiercely, and I came to understand slowly over the following years, never fully made peace with their father remarrying. I want to be fair to that grief because I think it matters to the whole story. Patrice and Marcus lost their mother to ovarian cancer when Patrice was 22 and Marcus was 19, old enough to grieve as adults, young enough that the loss reshaped the rest of their lives. When Walter and I married 3 years later, I understood even then that I was not simply marrying a man. I was entering a family that had already absorbed one irreplaceable loss, and that my presence, however well-intentioned, would always carry some weight of substitution that I had never asked to carry and could not fully set down. I tried for 22 years to carry it gracefully. I did not attempt to replace their mother. I made a point from the very beginning of referring to her by name in family conversations, of keeping her photographs displayed in the house, of never once suggesting that my relationship with Walter's children should resemble what they'd had with her. I built something different instead, not maternal, but something I genuinely believed was warm and real. Patrice and I went to lunch every few months for the first decade. Marcus and Walter and I took a fishing trip together most summers. I attended every grandchild's birthday party. I sent cards. I showed up. I remember specifically a conversation with Patrice in our 4th year of marriage when she was pregnant with her first child. She told me, sitting across from me at a restaurant we had chosen together, that she had been afraid I would try to take her mother's place, and that I had not done that, and that she was grateful. I have held on to that conversation for 20 years because it felt, at the time, like the foundation of something real between us, an acknowledgement that we had each navigated something difficult and arrived somewhere honest. Something shifted gradually after Walter's first heart surgery in 2015. I do not know exactly why. I have theorized about it more than I am entirely comfortable admitting, turning it over in my mind during the long nights of his final illness, wondering what I missed or did wrong. What I observed, factually, was this: Patrice's visits became less frequent and more clinical, focused on logistics rather than relationship. Marcus, who lived 4 hours away in Asheville, began calling Walter directly rather than through me, in a way that felt increasingly like a deliberate construction of two separate channels of communication, one that ran through me, which thinned, and one that bypassed me entirely, which thickened. I told myself it was the natural anxiety of adult children watching a parent's health decline. I did not know, until 11 days after Walter's funeral, how much had been happening in that second channel that I had never been permitted to see. I think, looking back with the clarity that only comes after a thing has fully played out, that the 2015 heart surgery was when Patrice began, consciously or not, preparing herself for a future in which her father would not be present to mediate between her and me, and that the preparation took the form, eventually, of a will conversation I was never invited into, conducted in a channel of communication that had been quietly built to exclude me for nearly a decade before it mattered. Walter's final year was the hardest of my life, and I do not say that lightly, having lived 66 years that included a difficult first marriage and a divorce I did not choose. He had a stroke in March of that year that took his speech almost entirely for the first 4 months and never fully returned his left-hand function. I learned to understand him through gesture and the rebuilding fragments of language that came back slowly, painstakingly, over physical therapy sessions 3 times a week that I drove him to myself. I want to describe what an ordinary day looked like during that year because I think the word caretaking can become abstract if it is not given specific texture. I woke at 5:30 to prepare his morning medications, organized in a pill box I refilled every Sunday evening with the precision of a pharmacist. I helped him to the bathroom, which by the 7th month required physical support on his weaker side. I prepared meals modified for the swallowing difficulties the stroke had left him with: thickened liquids, soft foods, small bites delivered slowly while watching his throat for the signs the speech therapist had taught me to recognize. I drove him to physical therapy on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, sat in the waiting room doing the crossword puzzle from the morning paper, and drove him home exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical effort of therapy and everything to do with the cumulative weight of relearning, in real time, who his body would allow him to be. I administered his medications on a schedule that woke me twice most nights. I learned to give him injections from a home health nurse who came twice a week and showed me what to do the other 5 days. I fed him in the final 2 months because his hands had stopped reliably finding his mouth. I did this without complaint, not because I am a saint, I am not, and there were nights I cried in the bathroom with the water running so he would not hear me, but because he was my husband and 22 years had made that an identity I did not know how to separate from caring for him completely. There is a particular intimacy in caring for someone's body at that level that I do not think people fully understand until they have lived it. You learn things about a person, about their fear, their stubbornness, their gratitude, their occasional flashes of the humor that illness had not entirely taken from them, that you could not have learned any other way, not even in 21 years of an otherwise healthy marriage. Walter, in the worst months of that final year, would sometimes manage, through the broken fragments of speech still available to him, to make a joke about his own condition, dark, self-deprecating, the same dry humor I had married him for 22 years earlier, and I would laugh genuinely in the middle of changing his clothes or cleaning him up after a difficult night, because that humor was still recognizably him. Still proof that the man I loved was still present inside the body that was failing him. Patrice visited 4 times during that final year. Each visit lasted under 2 hours. I remember each one specifically, not with resentment exactly, though I will admit some resentment has crept in with hindsight, but with a kind of careful cataloging that I now understand was my mind quietly building a record I did not yet know I would need. The Easter visit, where she stayed for 90 minutes and left before Walter's afternoon medication. The visit after his second hospitalization, where she sat in the living room rather than the bedroom where he was resting, and asked me more than him about his prognosis. The two other visits I can barely distinguish from each other in memory, both brief, both more about appearing present than being present. Marcus visited twice, both times when Walter was sleeping, in conversations conducted mostly with me, about logistics, insurance forms, a power of attorney document Walter had apparently signed with Marcus present that I learned about only when Marcus mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew. I did not know that should have told me something. It did not at the time register as the warning it was. I was too exhausted, too consumed by the daily mechanics of keeping my husband alive and as comfortable as possible, to interrogate what a power of attorney conversation conducted without my knowledge might mean about the larger architecture being built around Walter's final wishes. If you have ever given everything you had to caring for someone you loved, while people on the periphery were quietly building something you couldn't see, type, I understand in the comments. I read every word. Walter died in April. The funeral was on a Thursday. 11 days later, on a Monday, Patrice called. She did not call to check on me. I understood that within the first sentence. She called with a script. I recognized it as a script because of how evenly she delivered it without the small hesitations and corrections of ordinary speech, the cadence of someone who has practiced what they intend to say, perhaps even written it down beforehand and read from notes. There was no, "How are you holding up?" There was no acknowledgement of the 11 days that had passed, of what those 11 days had likely looked like for me. She moved directly into the substance of the call within the first 30 seconds. She told me that Walter's will, executed in 2019, left the house on Sedgefield Road and the majority of his estate to her and Marcus, with what she called a provision for me. She read me a sentence from the will. I want to be precise about this because the precision matters to everything that follows. She read, "To my wife Marguerite, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal effects." I said, "Patrice, that's not possible. Walter and I bought that house together in 2003. My name is on the deed." She said, "I'm not going to argue real estate law with you over the phone, Marguerite. I have a copy of the will right here. I'm telling you what it says." I want to describe the particular quality of her voice in that moment because I think it is relevant to everything that came after. It was not cruel exactly. It was something closer to bureaucratic, the voice of someone delivering an unpleasant administrative fact, the way you might tell a customer that a return window has closed. There was no acknowledgement that she was speaking to the woman who had spent the last year of her father's life keeping him alive through hand-feeding and middle-of-the-night injections. There was only the document, presented as final. I asked her to send me a copy. She said she would have their attorney forward it. It arrived 3 days later, 4 pages, the relevant section highlighted in yellow, the same sentence she had read me on the phone, isolated on the page in a way that made it look complete. Those 3 days were difficult in a particular way I had not anticipated. I did not sleep well. I found myself more than once walking through the rooms of the house, the kitchen where Walter and I had eaten 10,000 meals together, the bedroom where I had cared for him in his final months, the garden visible from the window, trying to imagine packing it all into 30 days, trying and failing to imagine where I would even begin to live a different life at 66, 11 days into widowhood. With what Patrice had told me was $50,000 and whatever personal effects I could carry out the door. It was not complete. I did not know that yet. What I knew was that I had been married to Walter Sinclair for 22 years, that my name was on the deed to the house I had lived in for 2 decades, and that a 4-page document with 1 sentence highlighted in yellow was being presented to me as the entirety of my husband's final wishes regarding the life we had built together. I called my name on that deed. I called the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds the next morning. The deed was real. My name was on it beside Walter's exactly as I remembered. Whatever the will said, the house itself, the physical structure, the land beneath it, had 2 owners listed at the county courthouse, and one of them was still alive. But I needed to understand the will completely, not in the fragment Patrice had chosen to read me. I called an attorney. If you have ever given everything you had to caring for someone you loved, while people on the periphery were quietly building something you couldn't see, type, "I understand" in the comments. I read every word. The attorney's name was Theodora Brambleton. She had practiced estate law in Charlotte for 19 years, and the first thing she asked me, before she even looked at the 4 pages Patrice had sent, was, "Marguerite, do you have a copy of the deed to the house?" I did. I had pulled it from the county records office myself. She looked at it, she said, "This confirms what you told me. You and Walter held this property as tenants by the entirety, which is the standard form of joint ownership for married couples in North Carolina. Under that form of ownership, when one spouse dies, the surviving spouse automatically becomes the sole owner of the property. It does not pass through the will at all. It is not part of his estate to distribute. Whatever the will says about the house is, legally, irrelevant. The house already belonged entirely to you the moment Walter died, by operation of property law, regardless of what any will document might claim." I sat with that for a long moment. I asked her to repeat it more slowly because I needed to understand it completely and not just emotionally. I needed to be able to explain it myself later to people who would not want to hear it. She repeated it, this time walking me through each piece. The legal term tenancy by the entirety, which exists specifically to protect married couples from exactly the situation I had just been threatened with. The automatic transfer at death, which requires no probate process, no court filing, no will provision whatsoever. The simple, structural fact that Walter's signature on a will document, however his attorney had drafted it, could not override what North Carolina property law had already determined the moment the deed was recorded in both our names back in 2003. I said, "Then why would Patrice tell me I had 30 days to leave?" Theodora said, "I suspect because she does not understand the legal distinction, or because she is hoping you don't. I'd like to see the full will, not the 4 pages you were sent. Can you request the complete document from their attorney?" I requested it. It took 2 weeks and 1 formal letter from Theodora before Patrice's attorney produced the full document, 11 pages, not 4. Those 2 weeks were not easy to live through. I continued sleeping poorly. I continued, despite everything Theodora had told me about the deed, feeling an undercurrent of dread each time my phone rang, half expecting Patrice to call again with some new variation of the same ultimatum. Theodora told me more than once during that waiting period that the legal reality did not depend on Patrice's cooperation or understanding. The house was mine regardless of what she believed or what she said on the phone, but knowing that intellectually, and feeling it in my body during sleepless 3 a.m. hours were 2 very different experiences. What the complete will revealed once it finally arrived was this: the sentence Patrice had read me, to my wife Marguerite, "I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal effects," was real, and it did appear in the document. But it appeared in a section specifically addressing the distribution of Walter's separate, non-marital assets. A business interest in a commercial property he had owned before our marriage, and an investment account he had maintained separately throughout our marriage under an agreement we had made early on, at my own insistence, that some of his premarital assets would remain distinctly his to direct as he saw fit, given that he had 2 children from his first marriage with their own claims to that particular history. The house was never in that section. The house, because of how it was titled, was never part of the probate estate at all. It had passed to me automatically and entirely the moment Walter died, exactly as Theodora had explained, regardless of anything the will said or did not say about it. Patrice and her attorney had read me 1 sentence from a will addressing assets that were never the house, and had allowed me to believe, for 16 days, that it governed the only home I had lived in for 2 decades. I read through all 11 pages myself twice after Theodora confirmed her interpretation. I wanted to see with my own eyes the structure of the document, to understand not just that I had been misled, but precisely how the misleading had been constructed. The will was organized, like most estate documents, into distinct sections: specific bequests, residuary estate, the disposition of separate property. The house was never mentioned in any of those sections because it had never needed to be. It existed, legally, Entirely outside, the document Patrice had been quoting to me as though it contained the whole truth of what I would be left with. I called Patrice myself, with Theodora's guidance on what to say and, more importantly, what not to concede. I said, Patrice, I have the complete will now, 11 pages, not the 4 you sent me. I understand now that the $50,000 provision applies to your father's separate assets, the commercial property and the investment account, not to the house. The house was never part of his estate. It became mine entirely, by law, the moment he died because of how it was titled. I'd like you to explain to me why you told me I had 30 days to vacate a house that was never going to be distributed through that will in the first place. There was a silence longer than the one from our first call. She said, our attorney told us the will gave us the house. I said, did your attorney see the deed? Another silence, then, I don't know. I said, I think you should ask him, because mine looked at the deed in the first 5 minutes and what he found means I am not going anywhere, Patrice. Not in 30 days, not ever unless I choose to. I want to describe what it felt like to say those words because I think it matters. I had spent 22 years being careful with Patrice, careful not to overstep, careful to defer to her relationship with her father, careful to make space for her grief in ways that sometimes meant making myself smaller than I needed to be. This was the first time in 2 decades that I spoke to her with the full, unhedged authority of someone who knew, with complete legal certainty, that she was wrong and that I was not required to soften that fact for her comfort. What followed in the weeks after that call was not warm. I will not pretend it became warm. Patrice did not apologize for the 30-day ultimatum or for reading me an isolated sentence designed to frighten me into compliance before I had time to consult anyone. What happened instead was a kind of strategic retreat. Her attorney, once shown the deed and the tenancy by entirety documentation Theodora provided, acknowledged in writing that the house was not and had never been subject to probate distribution. Patrice and Marcus's claim to it, such as it had ever been, dissolved the moment that letter was sent. I received that letter from their attorney on a Friday afternoon. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the same window over the garden, and reading it 3 times the way I had read the original 4 pages 3 times. This time, though, what I was reading confirmed rather than threatened. 3 short paragraphs, professionally worded, conceding entirely. I sat with that letter for a long time before I called Theodora to tell her it had arrived. Marcus called me separately about 10 days after that exchange of letters. His tone was different from Patrice's, less rehearsed, more uncertain. He said, Marguerite, I want you to know I didn't know what Patrice was planning when she called you. I thought the will gave us a portion of the house. I didn't understand the deed situation until our attorney explained it to me last week. I said, I believe you, Marcus. I don't think you believe me, but I believe you. He said, I am sorry for the 30 days, for all of it. I said, I appreciate that, I mean that. I did not extend the same grace to Patrice because Patrice had not asked for it, and because I had come to understand over the course of those weeks that Patrice's version of the call, the script, the highlighted sentence, the confident assertion of a 30-day deadline before any attorney had actually verified the legal reality, was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated attempt to use my grief and my unfamiliarity with property law to remove me from my own home before I had the resources or the clarity to resist. I think about the difference between Marcus's call and Patrice's call often. Marcus had been wrong, but he had been wrong in a way that suggested genuine confusion, followed by genuine reconsideration once he understood the facts. Patrice had been wrong in a way that suggested she had not particularly cared whether she was right, as long as the call achieved its intended effect before anyone had time to check. The legal resolution, once the deed was properly understood by everyone involved, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. The house on Sedgefield Road was mine, fully and outright, exactly as it had been the moment Walter's heart stopped. No 30-day deadline, no negotiation, no portion to surrender. Theodora's letter to Patrice and Marcus's attorney was 3 paragraphs long and ended the entire dispute. I want to dwell for a moment on how strange it is that something which caused weeks of sleepless nights, of imagining packing a life into 30 days, of feeling the ground genuinely shift beneath a home I had lived in for 2 decades, resolved itself through 3 paragraphs of correctly applied property law. That asymmetry, the enormous emotional weight of the threat against the comparative simplicity of its legal dissolution, has stayed with me. It is, I think, the central injustice embedded in situations like mine. The threat costs the person receiving it everything in anxiety and sleeplessness and fear, while costing the person making it almost nothing if it turns out to be unfounded. Patrice risked very little by telling me I had 30 days to leave. I risked, in those 16 days before Theodora confirmed the truth, my entire sense of where I belonged in the world. The $50,000 and the personal effects clause regarding Walter's separate premarital assets, I did receive. That part of the will was legitimate and I had no objection to it. Walter had built that commercial property and that investment account before he knew me, with the income from a career I had no part in, and I had always understood and agreed that those specific assets would eventually go to his children, with a smaller designated sum reserved for me as a gesture of his ongoing care. I did not contest that provision. I had never wanted to contest it. What I had needed to understand was that it was the only part of the estate his will actually controlled, and that everything Patrice had told me about the house was either a misunderstanding she had not bothered to verify, or a deliberate distortion she had hoped I would not have the resources to investigate. I think, honestly, it was some combination of both. Grief makes people do things they might not otherwise do, and I do not believe Patrice woke up one morning and decided to become someone who would manipulate a grieving stepmother out of her home through selective reading of a legal document. I think she had spent years quietly resenting a structure she never chose, her father remarrying, a stepmother present at every family occasion, a second wife who had been the one in the room for the hardest year of her father's life while she herself, by her own admission and her own evident guilt about it, had visited 4 times. I think the 30-day ultimatum was less a calculated fraud than a grief-driven attempt to reclaim something that felt, to her, like it had always belonged to her family before I arrived in it. That understanding has not made the 11 days between the funeral and that phone call easier to think about. It has made them easier to live with. I have asked myself many times in the months since whether I owe Patrice any further effort toward reconciliation, given the understanding I have come to about what likely drove her behavior. I do not have a settled answer. What I know is that understanding why someone hurt you does not obligate you to absorb further hurt from them, and that the relationship between Patrice and me, going forward, will require her to demonstrate something more than an attorney's 3-paragraph concession before I extend the kind of trust I once extended freely, for 22 years, without ever being asked to verify whether it was warranted. I think, too, about Theodora's role in all of this, and how different the outcome might have been without her specific expertise in North Carolina property law, knowledge that I did not have, that Patrice apparently did not have, that even Patrice's own attorney did not initially seem to have applied correctly to the facts of my situation. There is a particular kind of vulnerability in being a layperson confronted with a confident legal assertion from someone who has, or claims to have, professional backing. I did not know what tenancy by the entirety meant before Theodora explained it to me, slowly and patiently, more than once, until I could have repeated the explanation myself to anyone who asked. I suspect very few people outside of real estate law do. That gap in ordinary knowledge is exactly the space where a confident misstatement, made by someone who sounds certain, can do enormous damage before anyone with the right expertise is brought in to correct it. This is, I think, the deeper lesson embedded in what happened to me, not simply that I was fortunate enough to have my name correctly on a deed, though I was, but that the gap between what most people understand about property law and what the law actually says is wide enough to be exploited, intentionally or not, by anyone willing to speak with enough confidence into that gap. I was lucky in one specific, narrow way. Walter had been careful when we bought the house in 2003, and that carefulness, more than 2 decades later, became the single most important protection I had against losing everything I had spent those same 2 decades building alongside him. My name is Marguerite Sinclair. I am 66 years old. I still live in the house on Sedgefield Road in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Walter and I raised no children of our own but built 22 years of a marriage that included his children, his grandchildren, his final illness, and his death, a marriage that the law in the end recognized as completely and unambiguously real, regardless of what one daughter's grief tried to tell me in the rawest days after I buried him. I think often about the difference between what people tell you a document says and what the document actually says. Patrice read me one sentence, isolated and highlighted, and asked me to build an entire understanding of my future on that single sentence. I could have done it. I was exhausted, grieving, and unfamiliar with the specific mechanics of property law in a state I had lived in for over 2 decades. Many women in my position would have started packing within the week, simply because someone with apparent authority told them the document said so. I did not pack. I asked to see the rest of it. That single decision, to request the complete document rather than accept the fragment I was offered, turned out to be the entire foundation of everything that followed. I have thought a great deal in the months since about why I was able to make that decision when I was at my most exhausted and most vulnerable. I do not think it was bravery exactly, though people have used that word to describe it. I think it was something closer to a habit built over 22 years of marriage to a careful, methodical man. Walter was an engineer. He believed in verifying things before accepting them, in understanding the full structure of a problem before responding to any single piece of it. I absorbed that habit across 2 decades of watching him apply it to everything from home repairs to financial decisions, without ever consciously deciding to adopt it as my own. When Patrice called with her 4 highlighted pages, some part of me that Walter had quietly trained over 22 years said, "This is incomplete, and incomplete information is not a sufficient basis for a decision this large." I want to say something to every woman listening to this who has ever been told in a moment of grief or vulnerability that a document says something final and irreversible about her life. Ask to see the whole document, not the highlighted sentence, not the paraphrase delivered with confidence over the phone. The complete pages in their original order, read by someone whose job it is to understand exactly what they say and what they do not say. Grief does not disqualify you from that right, and the people who hope you will be too tired or too sad to exercise it are counting, specifically, on your exhaustion doing their work for them. I think too about what this experience taught me regarding the particular vulnerability of being a stepparent, a role that carries enormous responsibility, especially in a long-term marriage with significant caregiving at its end, but that is so often treated by adult stepchildren and sometimes by the legal system itself as somehow less permanent, less legitimate, less deserving of automatic protection than a first marriage might receive. I was Walter's wife for 22 years. I cared for him through illnesses that would have tested any marriage, illnesses that asked more of me, physically and emotionally, than most marriages are ever asked to give. And I was, for 16 days, made to feel that none of that mattered against a single misread sentence, because the family narrative some people carry about second marriages is that the second wife is a guest in a story that fundamentally belongs to someone else. The law did not agree with that narrative. North Carolina's tenancy by entirety statute does not distinguish between first marriages and second marriages, between wives who raised stepchildren successfully and wives who did not, between marriages of 2 years and marriages of 22. It simply recognizes that 2 people who jointly own a home as spouses have made each other, by the structure of that ownership, the automatic survivor of the other's death. That recognition existed for me the moment Walter's heart stopped, whether or not Patrice acknowledged it, whether or not I understood it myself in the first 11 days of my grief. Walter's photograph sits on the mantel in the living room, beside a photograph of his first wife, Eleanor, the way it always has, the way I always insisted it should. I did not need to erase her to belong in that house. I did not need a will to confirm what 22 years of caring for a man through 2 heart surgeries, a stroke, and a final year of complete physical dependence had already made true in every sense that matters. I have rebuilt slowly something resembling a relationship with Marcus, who calls now every few weeks, the way he used to call his father directly, except now the calls run through me because I am the only parent left for him to call. He asks about the garden. He asks if I am eating properly. Small questions, but they are the questions of someone who has decided in his own quiet way that the relationship is worth maintaining even without his father as the bridge between us. Patrice and I speak occasionally, carefully, about logistics, her children's birthdays, a family gathering we both attended in the fall, conducted with a politeness that has not yet become warmth and may never become warmth again, but that has at least stopped being adversarial. I do not know if we will ever recover what I believed for 19 years we had built together. I have made my peace with not knowing. I do not believe in fate any more than the next person, and I do not think there was anything inevitable about the protection I ended up having. It could easily have gone differently. Walter could have made a different choice about how to title the house decades ago, or North Carolina's property laws could have been structured differently than they are, or I could have simply accepted Patrice's 4 highlighted pages at face value and never thought to ask Theodora the one question that changed everything. I am grateful more than proud when I think about how this resolved. Gratitude feels like the more honest word for what I carry now, sitting in the same kitchen, looking out at the same garden, in a house that is, finally and completely, only and entirely mine. The deed said what it said, the law recognized what it recognized, and the last word about whose house this is was never going to belong to a sentence read aloud over the phone, highlighted in yellow, 11 days after a funeral. It belonged to the woman who stayed in the room through every single one of the 22 years that made the deed true in the first place. If you have ever been told a document said something final about your life and found the strength to ask for the rest of the pages, type, "I asked for the rest" in the comments. I read every single word.